So I want you to picture a map of a country.
Okay.
But I want you to paint like almost the entire landmass in this lush, vibrant, unbroken green.
Which is a pretty rare visual these days.
Right, exactly. We're talking about a staggering 94.4% forest cover.
Wow.
Just an absolute pristine ocean of trees, river systems, and biodiversity that stretches practically from border to border.
It is a striking visual to start with. I mean, when you look at the global environmental data, that 94.4% figure represents the highest percentage of forest cover of any nation on Earth.
Which is amazing.
It really is. By all ecological metrics, it's a green paradise. Like one of the last true sanctuaries we have left.
Right. But now, I want you to hold that beautiful, tranquil green map in your mind and mentally overlay it with a line chart.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah, and this line chart isn't tranquil at all. It's this violently swinging, jagged line that looks like the teeth of a saw.
That's a great way to describe it.
And that jagged line represents this country's GDP growth over the last few decades.
And right there in that one visual collision, you capture the ultimate, cognitive dissonance of this specific economy.
Yeah.
The profound tension between the physical land and the macroeconomic ledger.
Exactly. When you cross-reference this visual with the raw World Bank, IMF, and the UN data sets we've been poring over,
Right.
specifically focusing on a comprehensive national development research report regarding the Republic of Suriname, a deeply counterintuitive question emerges.
It really does.
How does a green paradise, sitting on a literal gold mine of natural resources, find itself trapped in an economic labyrinth?
The labyrinth is exactly what it is.
Right, a labyrinth where recently the inflation rate didn't just creep up, but rocketed past 140%.
It is a fascinating, highly complex case study. I mean, what we are doing today in this deep dive is pulling apart that raw data completely impartially.
Yep.
We're going to look at the underlying mechanics spanning macroeconomics, human capital metrics, ecological data, and institutional governance.
All the heavy hitters.
Exactly. The goal is to determine whether Suriname's immense natural wealth is, a catalyst for a demographic dividend, or if we were looking at the underlying architecture of a textbook resource curse.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the labyrinth, we have to look at the walls.
Right.
And the walls here are built on extreme macroeconomic volatility.
Extreme is the right word.
Yeah, so looking at the GDP growth data spanning from 1960 all the way to 2023, the sheer amplitude of the swings is what really stands out.
It's dizzying.
It is. The highs are incredibly high, but the contractions are just devastating.
Yeah.
Specifically, if we isolate the year 2020, there is a cliff-edge drop of negative 15.9% in GDP.
A negative 15.9% contraction in a single fiscal year is a catastrophic shock to any economic system.
This is massive.
Right. Now, obviously, the global pandemic was the primary catalyst for that specific drop in 2020.
Sure, global supply chains froze.
Exactly. But if you zoom out and look at the historical data series, that jagged sawtooth curve is not an anomaly.
No, it's not.
It has been a persistent structural feature of Suriname's economy for decades. It spikes, it crashes, it spikes, it crashes.
Which implies that the 2020 drop wasn't just about a virus.
Right.
It was about the underlying fragility of the system facing a stress test, like a ship without a keel.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, it's capable of moving fast when the wind is right, but it's completely prone to capsizing at the slightest wave.
Precisely. That extreme irregularity points to an economy that is fundamentally vulnerable to what we call external shocks.
And when we say external shocks, for the listener, we're talking about things outside of their control, right?
Yes, exactly. Largely, we're talking about global commodity price swings.
Okay.
If your economy is overwhelmingly tethered to the export of a few raw materials, historically in this case bauxite, gold, and oil, you effectively surrender your macroeconomic sovereignty to the global market.
Because you obviously don't control the price of gold in London or New York.
Exactly. If global demand shifts or, a recession hits major importing nations, the price of your core export just plummets.
Right.
In a highly diversified economy, a drop in commodity prices is a sector-specific problem. It's a bump in the road.
Because it's offset by something else.
Right. Offset by Perhaps an expanding tech sector or resilient domestic manufacturing.
But in a concentrated, commodity-dependent economy like Suriname's.
A single bearish year on the global commodities exchange can instantly wipe out a decade of domestic economic progress.
Wow. So the transmission mechanism here is that global prices dictate export revenues,
Yeah.
which dictate government tax receipts, which then dictate public spending. It's totally pro-cyclical.
That is the exact pro-cyclical trap.
When times are good, the government is flush with cash and spends heavily, overheating the economy.
Right.
But when prices drop, revenue vanishes, and the government has to drastically cut spending right when the economy needs stimulus the most.
It amplifies the volatility rather than smoothing it out.
Yeah.
And you can see how this constant boom and bust cycle makes long-term capital investment nearly impossible.
Because businesses can't forecast demand.
Exactly.
So if the overall macro environment is this volatile, what is actually driving it day to day? Like, what is absorbing the shock on the ground?
We have to look at the structural breakdown of the economy.
Right, the proportion of agriculture, industry, and services. And the data reveals a really profound shift over the last few decades.
The sectoral composition data is highly revealing. I mean, it tells the story of how the domestic workforce and capital are reacting to this macro volatility.
So looking at the value add of those three main sectors, the shift towards services is massive.
It's a huge pivot.
Yeah. In the earlier years of the data set, the service sector hovered around 40% of GDP.
Right.
But more recently, it has climbed steadily, totally dominating the economic profile at over 50% of total GDP.
Now, on paper, if you hear that an economy is transitioning to a majority service-based model, the initial assumption is often positive.
Yeah, you think modern, right.
Exactly. We generally associate service-dominated economies with advanced post-industrial development.
Like economies driven by global finance or high-tech software engineering?
Or advanced logistics, sure. But in economic analysis, context is everything. You have to examine the nature of the services being provided.
Right.
And crucially, you have to look at what sector is shrinking to make room for that growth.
Because, I mean, you aren't seeing a boom in Suriname's tech unicorns.
No, you're really not.
When we look at the industrial sector, which includes domestic manufacturing, processing, and construction, it is incredibly erratic.
Highly erratic.
The data shows it actually hit a massive peak, accounting for over 47% of GDP back in 2004.
Right.
But since then, it has experienced a severe multi-year downward slide.
And that downward slide in industrial capacity is the exact vulnerability we need to isolate.
Okay, unpack that.
The service sector in this context isn't growing because of high-value innovation.
It's not the next Silicon Valley.
No. It's growing as a percentage of GDP, largely because the industrial production capacity is collapsing.
Oh.
This is a form of premature deindustrialization.
Imagine the town you live in suddenly losing half its manufacturing base, right? And everyone having to pivot to service jobs. It changes the entire social fabric.
Completely alters it.
I originally assumed the drop in industrial output was just a failure to modernize local factories.
It's deeper than that.
Yeah, looking at the broader data, I'm starting to wonder if the traditional industrial sector didn't just naturally decline, but was like actively choked out by the volatility we just talked about.
It is actively choked out. And the mechanism for that choking is intimately tied to what Suriname is pulling out of the earth.
The minerals.
Yes. When your domestic industrial base weakens, your economic resilience evaporates.
Because you're no longer producing tangible goods.
Right. You aren't processing raw materials into higher value products domestically.
So labor shifts from formal manufacturing jobs into the service sector.
And in developing contexts, that often means informal, low productivity services.
Like retail, street vending, basic transport.
Exactly.
So you go from an economy that builds things to an economy that just circulates money around locally without generating new value-added exports.
That's the exact dynamic.
Which forces us to look at where the actual new wealth is coming from. Because if manufacturing is shrinking and agriculture is historically a tiny fraction of the GDP...
The money keeping the lights on has to be coming from the ground.
Yes. This brings us to the core structural imbalance of the economy, the overwhelming reliance on mineral extraction.
The data regarding mineral rents is perhaps the most critical indicator in the entire report.
So let's lay out exactly what that metric means for a second.
Sure.
Mineral rents measure the difference between the global market value of a stock of extracted minerals and the total cost of producing them.
Right, so it is essentially the pure profit.
Exactly. The economic surplus generated solely by extracting the resource. And the data shows that at their peak, these mineral rents accounted for over 27.5% of Suriname's entire GDP.
Over a quarter of the GDP.
Yeah.
What is fascinating here is how that 27.5% figure contextualizes the deindustrialization we just discussed.
Right.
When more than a quarter of your entire national economic output is just pure rent from digging gold and bauxite out of the earth, you are operating under a totally different economic paradigm.
You aren't building a diversified economic engine.
No, you are liquidating a finite asset.
Wow. And furthermore, the metric for energy depletion as a percentage of gross national income fluctuates wildly alongside this.
Exactly. Energy depletion measures the loss of national wealth as these non-renewable resources are extracted and sold off.
Because once it's gone, it's gone.
Exactly. It reinforces the reality that this revenue stream is temporary and highly variable.
Right.
This entire dynamic is the textbook foundation of the classic economic theory known as the resource curse.
And specifically, the mechanism called Dutch disease.
Yes, Dutch disease.
I want to make sure we clearly define how Dutch disease works mechanically here, because it's pretty counterintuitive.
It is, yeah.
It's like an athlete who relies solely on steroids to build muscle.
I like this analogy.
The injections, the mineral revenues, work incredibly fast and make the overall GDP look massive.
Right.
But beneath the surface, the body's natural systems, the traditional manufacturing and agriculture sectors, are quietly atrophying because the body isn't doing the natural, holistic work of building diverse muscle groups.
That is an excellent analogy, and we can trace the exact physiological mechanisms of how those traditional sectors atrophy.
Okay, let's trace it.
There are two main transmission channels in Dutch disease.
Right.
The resource movement effect and the spending effect.
Let's break those down. What's the resource movement effect?
Well, the resource movement effect happens when the booming mining sector sucks up all the available capital and skilled labor in the country.
Oh, because they pay more.
Exactly. If you are an engineer or a heavy machinery operator, you are going to go work for the gold mine because they can afford to pay wages that a local textile factory simply cannot match.
So the traditional industrial sector loses its talent and its investment capital.
It drains it completely.
And the spending effect.
The spending effect is driven by currency dynamics. When a country exports massive amounts of gold, foreign buyers pay in foreign currency.
Usually U.S. dollars.
Right. These dollars flood into the domestic economy and are converted into the local currency.
Okay, follow.
This massive influx of foreign capital artificially drives up the value, or the real exchange rate, of the local currency.
So if the local currency becomes artificially strong because of the gold exports,
Yes.
that essentially acts as a hidden tax on any other export sector.
Exactly. If I'm a Surinamese farmer trying to export rice or a manufacturer trying to export processed goods,
Our products are now incredibly expensive on the global market.
because my local currency is so strong, I can't compete with farmers in neighboring countries.
So your business withers and dies.
Exactly. The mining sector inadvertently kills off all other export industries.
And what makes this so dangerous is the government incentive structure.
How so?
Well, taxing a diversified base of citizens and small businesses requires strong institutions, right? Transparency, political capital. It's difficult.
Very difficult.
But taking a massive cut from a multinational mining corporation in the form of mineral rents, that's administratively very easy.
It creates a rentier state.
Yeah.
The government becomes completely reliant on the easy mining revenue to fund its budget.
And they neglect the difficult work of building an efficient tax system.
Or nurturing a competitive business environment for non-mining sectors.
But the spheroids eventually wear off, or, the global price of gold drops.
And when that happens, the government suddenly faces a catastrophic revenue shortfall.
But they still have fixed liabilities.
Right. They still have to pay public sector salaries, fund schools, and service debt.
And without a diversified tax base to fall back on, they are pushed into a corner.
And historically, when pushed into that fiscal corner, governments resort to the most destructive financing mechanism available.
Which is?
Monetizing the debt.
Yep.
They instruct the central bank to just print money to cover the fiscal deficit.
Which triggers the absolute nightmare scenario in our data.
The inflation nightmare.
Yes. Looking at the consumer price index, the CPI, the inflation metrics are just staggering.
They are hard to look at.
In 2020, inflation hit 59.1%.
That alone is a crisis that destroys savings.
And it didn't stop there. In 2021, inflation skyrocketed to an unbelievable 143.5%.
Over 140%.
Imagine your monthly rent, grocery, and utility bills more than doubling in a single calendar year.
It's devastating.
And even after that peak, the system didn't reset. Inflation remained at a crushing 52.4% in 2022.
A 143.5% inflation rate fundamentally alters the psychology of a society.
How do you even plan for the future?
You don't. It is the total erosion of the primary function of money as a store of value. We need to look at the mechanisms driving this specific flavor of hyperinflation because it's deeply tied to external vulnerabilities.
The data points to a massive devaluation of the currency. The official exchange rate of the local currency unit, the Surinamese dollar, experienced a rapid stepladder devaluation,
Right.
recently breaking well past 30 units to a single U.S. dollar.
And that exchange rate collapse is the direct transmission mechanism for the inflation.
Because of the deindustrialization we discussed earlier.
Yes, Suriname has to import almost everything. Machinery, vehicles, medicine, and crucially, a large portion of its food supply.
And international suppliers do not accept Surinamese dollars. They want U.S. dollars or euros.
Exactly. This brings us to another terrifying metric in the dataset.
Which one?
The ratio of broad money to total reserves.
Okay, wait. Let's break that down for people who are economists. What exactly is broad money?
Broad money is essentially all the local currency circulating in the economy plus bank deposits.
Okay. And total reserves.
Total reserves are the foreign currencies like U.S. dollars and gold held by the central bank.
Got it.
Around 2020, the data shows a violent spike in this ratio.
Because the export revenues crashed, meaning foreign dollars stopped flowing in, which depleted the reserves.
Right.
And at the same time, the central bank was printing more local broad money to cover the government's budget deficit.
Precisely. The denominator, the foreign reserves, shrinks, while the numerator, the local broad money, explodes.
So the central bank no longer has the U.S. dollars required to defend the value of the Surinamese dollar on the foreign exchange market.
And the local currency goes into freefall.
And because the currency is suddenly worth a fraction of its previous value, the cost of importing that essential medicine, that machinery, that food, it doubles or triples overnight.
It's imported inflation.
Imported inflation combined with domestic monetary expansion. It's a vicious, self-reinforcing cycle.
It really is. As prices rise, citizens and businesses lose faith in the local currency. They engage in capital flight or dollarization, basically hoarding whatever U.S. dollars they can find or spending their local currency as quickly as possible before it loses more value.
Which increases the velocity of money, which drives inflation even higher.
Exactly.
It completely traps the average citizen. Wages simply cannot keep up with 143.5% annual inflation.
It can't.
It fundamentally breaks the social contract, pushing the middle class into poverty and threatening severe political instability.
So, if the traditional macroeconomy, the mineral extraction, the hollowed-out industry, the volatile currency is failing to provide stability, we have to look for alternative economic foundations. We have to look back at the feudal land itself.
Which pulls us back to the cognitive dissonance we started with. We have this hyper-volatile, inflation-ravaged economy sitting on top of a pristine, globally significant ecological asset.
Yes.
Let's look closely at the environmental data.
The environmental indicators present an entirely unique profile. I mean, in an era defined by global deforestation and habitat loss, Suriname is a massive outlier.
The data confirms it unequivocally. The forest area consistently remains above 94.4% of the total landmass.
Year after year, decade after decade.
To put that in perspective, if we look at the data for agricultural land, it accounts for a microscopic fraction hovering around 0.5%.
It's tiny.
And it has barely expanded over the past several decades.
From an ecological perspective, Suriname is an unparalleled success story. The Guiana Shield, which encompasses much of this forest, is one of the most vital carbon sinks and biodiversity hotspots left on the planet.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. I'm looking at this data and I'm realizing that this incredible environmental success is intrinsically linked to the economic stagnation.
How do you mean?
Well, maintaining 94.4% forest cover means, by definition, that you are not doing what almost every other industrialized or rapidly developing nation has done in history.
That is the core paradox. This raises an important question. The historical blueprint for economic development, the path utilized by the United States, Europe, China, and neighboring Brazil, relies heavily on taming and extracting from the wilderness.
Right. It involves clearing vast tracts of forest for industrial-scale agriculture,
Building sprawling manufacturing hubs.
paving extensive infrastructure networks to connect them all.
Suriname has effectively kept the bulldozers out. They have not liquidated their forests for timber or soy plantations.
But the opportunity cost of that conservation is massive.
It is. How does a developing country monetize conservation?
Right.
Currently, the dominant global economic system provides massive financial rewards for cutting down a tree and selling it as timber.
Or digging under the tree to extract gold.
Exactly. Historically, the global market offers zero financial reward for simply leaving the tree standing.
So the physical land is essentially untouchable if they want to maintain that sanctuary status and honor international climate commitments.
Yeah.
Which means the entire burden of economic transformation, of escaping the mineral curse and defeating hyperinflation, falls squarely on the human element, the citizens.
Exactly. If you cannot extract wealth horizontally by expanding across the land,
You have to extract wealth vertically.
by elevating the productivity and cognitive skills of your population.
This requires a deep dive into the demographic and human capital data.
Let's look at the numbers.
Looking at the demographic shifts, there is a silent but massive structural change occurring beneath the noise of the inflation crises.
The dependency ratios.
Yes, let's look at the dependency ratios. The old age dependency ratio, which compares the elderly population to the working age population, has climbed steadily over the decades.
Right.
It used to sit around 5%, but it has now reached roughly 11%.
It has more than doubled. This indicates a steadily aging population, largely driven by increased life expectancy and historical birth cohorts aging out of the workforce.
Conversely, the young age dependency ratio is on a clear downward trend, reflecting falling birth rates.
So you have fewer children being born and an aging but not yet massively dominant elderly population.
This means they are right in the middle of a classic demographic dividend.
They are. The demographic dividend is that golden window of economic opportunity where the proportion of working-age adults is at its absolute maximum relative to non-working dependents.
You have the maximum amount of human energy available to generate wealth.
But the window is closing. That rising 11% old-age dependency line is a ticking fiscal clock.
It is a critical warning signal.
It really is. Consider the fiscal mechanics of an aging population. An older demographic requires exponentially more state resources for healthcare, pensions, and social safety nets.
Right. Think about your own country's retirement systems and how hard they are to fund, even in stable, wealthy economies with robust tax bases.
Exactly.
Now, imagine trying to fund a ballooning pension system in an economy that recently experienced 143.5% inflation,
Where the currency is collapsing.
and where mineral revenues are completely unpredictable. It's a recipe for sovereign default.
It is. To survive the closing of this demographic window, the current working-age generation must become hyper-productive right now.
They need to generate enough surplus wealth over the next decade or two to build the sovereign wealth funds and tax bases required to support the aging population.
And hyperproductivity in a modern economy requires one thing above all else.
Advanced human capital.
Exactly. Which leads us directly into the educational data.
And I want to start by highlighting a massive quantifiable victory in the dataset.
Please do. We need some good news.
When it comes to gender equality and access to education, Suriname is excelling.
The gender parity data is genuinely a bright spot and a testament to targeted policy efforts.
Let's look at the Gender Parity Index, or GPI, specifically for secondary school enrollment. A score of 1.0 represents perfect equality between boys and girls.
Right.
The data shows Suriname consistently scoring above 1.1.
Which means
This means girls are not just equal. They are actively outperforming and out-enrolling boys in secondary education.
that is fantastic. Furthermore, when we look at the youth female literacy rate, measuring young women between the ages of 15 and 24, the figure sits at an incredibly impressive 97.9%.
That is nearly universal foundational literacy for young women.
It is.
But wait, if access is so good and literacy is that high, why isn't this translating into a highly skilled, booming service economy?
That's the million-dollar question.
We saw earlier that the service sector is growing, but it isn't generating the wealth needed to stabilize the country. Where is the transmission mechanism breaking down?
To find that breakdown, we have to shift our focus from the access data to the efficiency data.
Okay, let's look at efficiency.
Getting children into a classroom and ensuring basic literacy is step one. But what happens inside that classroom, the cognitive complexity of what is taught, is step two.
And the efficiency data reveals a severely broken pipeline.
It is a grim picture. The primary school repetition rates are the glaring red flag here.
The data shows that the percentage of students who are held back a grade because they failed to meet the standard stubbornly hovers between 15% and 25%.
Up to a quarter of all primary students are repeating grades.
Wow. And when you look at the survival rate to grade 5, which measures how many children who start the first grade actually make it to the 5th grade without dropping out.
The metric fluctuates wildly, indicating a massive dropout risk.
So the access is there, but the pipeline is leaking profusely. What is the underlying causality here?
It's a profound failure of resource allocation and instructional quality. A 25% repetition rate means the state is paying for a massive amount of redundant schooling.
They are literally paying twice to teach the same thing.
Exactly. It is burning its limited educational budget.
You are paying for 8 years of schooling, but the student is only achieving a 5th grade cognitive level.
Precisely. And we have to connect this back to the macro volatility.
How so?
Well, when inflation hits 143.5%, what happens to the real purchasing power of a public school teacher's salary?
It evaporates.
It evaporates. Teachers are forced to take second jobs in the informal sector just to survive.
Which leads to high absenteeism and severe degradation of instructional quality.
The system is producing basic literacy, but it is fundamentally failing to equip the workforce with the advanced analytical, technical, and digital skills required to compete in a globalized service economy.
So instead of graduating a cohort of advanced software engineers or financial analysts to build a modern service sector, the system is graduating young adults who, despite being literate, are only equipped for informal retail or manual labor.
The human capital is trapped.
It is entirely trapped, which forces us to ask the most uncomfortable but necessary question of this entire deep dive.
Which is?
Why are all of these state systems failing simultaneously? Why is the central bank failing to manage the money supply?
Why are the ministries failing to diversify the mineral wealth?
Why is the education system failing to efficiently deploy its resources?
To answer that, we have to look at the institutional bedrock. The data points to a deep structural rot at the governance level.
Now, I want to frame this explicitly and carefully. We aren't taking political sides here.
Absolutely not.
We are not endorsing any domestic political narratives within Suriname. We are strictly analyzing how international standardized frameworks measure institutional stability and state capacity.
That objective lens is vital. Institutional economics teaches us that the rules of the game, the legal frameworks, the enforcement mechanisms, the transparency of the state.
Right.
These are the ultimate determinants of long-term economic growth.
And the international institutional indices provided in the dataset paint a very concerning picture of those rules. Let's look at the control of corruption estimate.
This metric gauges the perception of the extent to which public power is exercised for private gain,
Including both petty and grand forms of corruption, as well as the capture of the state by elites.
Right. The data shows this estimate sliding dangerously over time.
Yeah, falling from positive territory down to a negative score, lingering around negative 0.40.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we also have to look at the rule of law percentile rank.
Which captures the extent to which agents have confidence in and abide by the rules of society, specifically the quality of contract enforcement, property rights, and the courts.
And this metric has repeatedly plummeted below the 40% mark globally.
Combine that with a regulatory quality metric that is incredibly unstable.
Yeah.
So we have a negative corruption score, weak rule of law, and unpredictable regulations. How does this institutional fragility directly repel the kind of economic development Suriname desperately needs?
It acts as a massive risk premium for foreign direct investment, or FDI.
Let's trace the mechanics of this. Imagine you're the CEO of a global tech company or a high-end renewable energy manufacturing firm.
Okay.
You are looking to build a new regional headquarters or factory. I have capital to deploy, and I'm looking for a return on investment.
Right. But when your risk analysts look at Suriname, they see a rule of law score below 40% and unstable regulatory quality.
So they calculate the probability that the local government might arbitrarily change the tax code overnight.
Or that a local competitor might bribe a judge to invalidate your property rights.
They quantify that risk, and it drastically lowers the projected ROI.
Exactly. The tech firm or the manufacturer decides the environment is too toxic, and they invest their capital in a neighboring country with stronger institutions instead.
So the high-quality, diversifying FDI completely avoids the country.
It vanishes.
But somebody is still investing, right? I mean, the gold mines are still operating.
Exactly. The only foreign entities willing to tolerate that level of institutional risk are typically extractive industries, mining and drilling corporations.
Why is that?
Because the margins on gold or oil are so massive that they can absorb the risk premium. Furthermore, extractive industries don't rely on broad society-wide contract enforcement. They negotiate bespoke, highly guarded agreements directly with the top levels of government.
Which perfectly closes the feedback loop of the resource curse.
Exactly.
The weak institutions repel diverse investment, leaving only the mining companies. The government becomes entirely reliant on the mining revenues, which incentivizes them to ignore building broad institutions.
Which keeps the corruption scores negative, which repels diverse investment. It is a perfectly sealed labyrinth.
Wow. It is a self-perpetuating cycle of rent-seeking behavior.
And crucially, this weak governance dictates how the mineral wealth is spent.
Because in a country with strong institutions, think Norway, that 27.5% of GDP from mineral rents is captured transparently
Tax efficiently.
and invested in a sovereign wealth fund to protect against external shocks.
Or heavily invested into world-class teacher training to fix the educational pipeline.
But with a control of corruption score of negative 0.40, that wealth leaks like a sieve.
It is captured by political elites, lost to bureaucratic inefficiency, or misallocated to patronage networks.
The wealth is literally pulled out of the soil, but it never reaches the primary school classroom to fix that 25% repetition rate.
The state fails its primary function as an efficient allocator of resources.
And when the state fails to provide a stable macroeconomic environment and high-quality public services, ordinary citizens are pushed into the margins of the economy.
Left to fend for themselves.
Which brings us to the human reality on the ground. We've analyzed the macro numbers and the institutional theory, but what does the labor market actually look like for the average Surinamese citizen navigating this labyrinth daily?
The labor market data is the direct downstream manifestation of everything we've discussed. It reflects a population forced into survival mechanisms.
Right.
The most glaring statistic is that self-employed individuals make up a massive 20% of total employment.
20%. And it's crucial we clarify what self-employed means in a developing macroeconomic context.
Yes.
We are not talking about highly paid freelance consultants or tech startup founders working from cafes.
No, not at all. In this data, high self-employment is a proxy for the informal economy.
It means street vending, unlicensed transportation, unregistered day labor.
It is survival entrepreneurship. When the formal private sector is choked out by the Dutch disease and the state cannot provide sufficient public sector jobs.
People simply invent informal work to feed their families.
But these jobs offer no social security, no health benefits, and no upward mobility.
And the data reveals a deeply troubling gender disparity within this vulnerable employment.
This is a critical point.
Earlier, we praised the incredible 98% youth female literacy rate and the fact that girls are outperforming boys in secondary school enrollment.
Yes, the educational access pipeline for women is strong.
But the labor data shows that vulnerable employment, particularly unpaid family labor or precarious informal work, disproportionately affects those exact same women.
Despite their high educational achievement, they are finding themselves trapped in the margins of the economy at higher rates than men.
That metric represents the ultimate failure of the economic transmission mechanism.
It really does. Society does everything right on the front end. They send the girls to school, the girls excel, they achieve universal literacy.
But upon graduation, they face an economy decimated by inflation, devoid of a diversified industrial base, and lacking a formal service sector capable of absorbing their talent.
The structural barriers force them back into vulnerable, informal roles. The human capital is effectively stranded.
It is incredibly frustrating to trace that data path.
It is.
However, inside this challenging landscape, the dataset does offer a distinct glimmer of hope. A potential bypass route around the broken institutions. Let's look at the digital connectivity data.
The telecommunications data provides the most viable vector for future growth.
While traditional internet usage metrics like fixed broadband connections in homes still show significant room for growth, the data for mobile cellular subscriptions has absolutely exploded.
The penetration rate is remarkable.
This trend is vital.
It is. In development economics, we view mobile connectivity as the ultimate leapfrog technology.
Because you don't need to rely on a dysfunctional state to lay expensive copper wire or fiber optics to every single house in a dense jungle terrain.
You just need cellular towers.
Exactly. When traditional physical institutions are broken, when the physical roads are deteriorating, when traditional banking is inaccessible to the rural poor,
And when the physical bureaucracy is hindered by a negative 0.40 corruption score.
mobile networks provide an alternative digital infrastructure.
Exactly. So with a cheap smartphone, that highly literate young woman who is currently trapped in the informal economy suddenly has a bypass route.
She gains access to mobile banking, totally circumventing traditional, inefficient financial gatekeepers.
She can access global online education platforms, bypassing the local primary schools with their 25% repetition rates.
She potentially gains access to remote digital freelance work, connecting directly to the modern global service economy without needing to migrate.
Mobile connectivity allows a population to route around the institutional labyrinth.
It lowers the barrier to entry for microenterprises and integrates marginalized populations into the broader digital economy.
It's a huge opportunity.
So bringing all these massive data points together, from the green forests to the volatile gold mines, from the failing schools to the rising mobile networks, how does Suriname chart a comprehensive path forward?
Based on a rigorous synthesis of the research report and all the underlying data sets, the roadmap out of this economic labyrinth rests on four critical, interconnected pillars.
Let's lay out the four pillars of transformation.
Sure.
Pillar number one, macroeconomic stability. You simply cannot build a long-term future on a sawtooth roller coaster.
No, you can't.
They must assert control over the monetary supply to crush that 140% hyperinflation. That requires rebuilding foreign exchange reserves, reining in procyclical government spending, and urgently optimizing the crushing burden of foreign debt so the state isn't paralyzed by interest payments.
Pillar two is the bedrock upon which the others rest: institutional governance.
The hardest one to fix?
Yes. They have to confront the rent-seeking behavior and pull that negative 0.40 control of corruption score into positive territory.
Economic diversification is impossible without a stable regulatory environment and a reliable, enforceable rule of law.
They must build institutions capable of attracting high-quality, diverse, foreign direct investment that isn't solely interested in digging a hole in the ground.
Pillar 3, human capital investment. They must urgently address the efficiency, not just the access, of their education system.
They have to fix the pedagogical and resource failures causing the 25% primary repetition rate.
And critically, they have to build the economic transmission mechanisms to bridge the gap between female educational achievement and the labor market.
That 98% literacy rate must translate into formal, high-quality jobs, likely leveraging that exploding mobile connectivity we just talked about.
And finally, Pillar 4, which brings us full circle to the green map, the green economic pivot.
They must strategically shift away from their historical fatal dependence on volatile mineral extraction.
They must find innovative global mechanisms to monetize their greatest inherent asset, that 94.4% forest cover, without destroying it.
So what does this all mean? When you look at these four pillars in totality, what is the ultimate takeaway?
What does this data tell us about the nature of national development?
It tells us that Suriname stands at a critical historical inflection point.
Right.
The overarching lesson from the data is profound. Natural resources are an arbitrary geographical gift, but governance is a deliberate human choice. You can sit on the richest gold veins on the planet, but if your institutional architecture is weak, that wealth will inevitably vanish into the ether of hyperinflation, corruption, and inefficiency.
Suriname's future depends entirely on its ability to balance its green heart, its incredible ecological preservation, with its institutional roots.
If the roots of governance are rotten, the national tree cannot thrive, regardless of how much mineral water you pour on it.
The tension between the land and the ledger. It is a stark reminder that the true wealth of a nation isn't just what is buried deep underground.
It is entirely dependent on how the society living above ground chooses to manage it, govern it, and distribute it.
I want to thank you for joining us on this really complex journey through Suriname's macroeconomic data. But before we wrap up,
I actually want to leave you with one final thought to mull over.
oh, let's hear it.
Something that builds directly on the data we've discussed today, but completely flips the traditional economic script. We spent a lot of time discussing the paradox of maintaining that 94.4% forest cover while trying to achieve traditional economic development.
Right.
But we are entering a 21st century global economy that is becoming increasingly desperate to mitigate catastrophic climate change.
True.
What if the traditional 20th century idea of development is entirely backward for a nation like Suriname?
Backward in what sense?
What if, in the very near future, the global community is forced to realize that Suriname's greatest possible economic contribution to the world is not extracting gold or clear-cutting land to produce agricultural goods or building traditional manufacturing hubs?
But instead,
What if their most valuable high-margin service is simply being financially compensated by the rest of the industrialized world through massive sovereign-level carbon credits or global conservation finance to do absolutely nothing but keep that 94.4% forest standing alive?
wow.
What if the ultimate economic engine for Suriname, the true escape from the labyrinth, is being paid by the rest of the planet to simply let the Earth breathe?
Being paid to keep the green map green, a complete inversion of the resource curse. It's a fascinating concept. We invite you to keep questioning the data around you, look past the surface of the headlines, and look out for our next deep dive.